And so I was assigned to test pilot duty in 1957, coming home from the Pacific. And you know what happened on October the 4th, 1957? Sputnik went up. And I realized that humans would be right behind robot spacecraft. And I thought, hey, that sounds like a pretty interesting thing. And my natural proclivity as a person asking irreverent questions about what's reality all about, decided that would be a good place to go, try to find out. So I immediately set my cap toward being an astronaut, although the word had not been invented at that point, because I knew humans would be right there. It was invented in the next few months. But I chose in October of 1957, on the way back from the Pacific on board a carrier, to change my career path, be a test pilot, get more education, and hopefully be selected into the astronaut program. And that did indeed happen in 1966, almost 9 years later. When I was selected, I was at Edgar Air Force Base as an instructor in the test pilot school, and got the privilege of going through the space portion of the school at that point, and selected into the astronaut program from there. So, but I want to point out, and this is bearing on some of the things we're talking about here. I want you young people to know, that was over 50 years ago, 52 years ago now, that our knowledge of what the universe was all about in the general public at that point in time was about as sophisticated as God in the heavens, man in the middle, and everything else below. We really didn't know doodly squat about what is out there. And we know an awful lot more now, thanks to going into space, particularly thanks to the Hubble telescope, particularly thanks to the magnificent images that are now being brought back over the last 10 years that help us see the universe in ways our ancestors and even our parents, certainly my parents, and even myself as a youngster growing up, had no idea what the universe was really alike from what we are now seeing from these magnificent pictures coming back from Hubble. They blow us away. From the astronomers are just flipping out over it. Those of us with a pretty good education in astronomy and astrophysics are doing the same thing, because the universe is bigger, more complex, more magnificent, more awesome, more problematic, with feedback loops and things that classical science and classical thinking simply cannot explain. And I will say to you that probably one of the sacred cows of our 20th century, that thought was explaining the way the universe arose, namely the Big Bang theory of how it all came about, is probably dead wrong. It's not the right one. Fred Hoyle, the British astronomer, was probably correct that we live in a universe that has a continuous creation of matter and is a relatively steady state creation of matter type universe. Now that puts a whole new twist on everything we've thought about. Now let's add in the fact that we have visitors, and the visitors clearly, from all the evidence that I have seen and been a part of, are not of this world. Now, to continue my little story that some of you don't know, most of you don't know, when I came back from space and being an astronaut and being pretty well knowledgeable in these areas, oh, by the way, and I did get a doctor's degree from MIT in aeronautics and astronautics back in the days when, as I just said, our knowledge of space was God in the heavens, man in the middle, and everything else below. But we were probing and trying to learn something. And I did get my PhD from MIT and in aeronautics and astronautics, because at the very beginning of the space program, we did realize, and our government did realize, that we didn't know anything about space. And if we're going to go into it, we better have some people that knew what we knew. And so doctoral programs and graduate programs were set up beginning at MIT, Princeton, and Caltech. Those were the first ones. And I was privileged to be in some of those first classes that went through and got advanced degrees. And that served me well. However, and Fred Hoyle pointed out in that period, when we first went into space, he said, if we ever get a picture of Earth from space, life will never be the same again. And he was right. Because as we've looked back at Earth like this, is this tiny little ball that you can put your thumb up and blot it out. And those of us who have been privileged to have that experience, life hasn't been the same again. And in my particular case, just briefly, since I was lunar module pilot on the third lunar landing, the first landing to do science on the moon, the very first lunar landing was just to prove that we could do it and get back off. That was Apollo 11. Well, that was their mission, prove we could do it and safely get back. Apollo 12 was to prove we could land precisely where we wanted to land and get back, because Apollo 11 had a little trouble finding a good landing spot. And so that left us, and I was Apollo 14. As you remember, Apollo 13, did you see the movie Apollo 13? Many of you did. Well, Apollo 13 was my original flight. And because I had served on Apollo 10, but with Gordon Cooper, and our policy was after you served as backup, and that was, you started out, you served as a backup crew for a mission, and then you could go to a prime crew. Well, I served as backup on Apollo 10, which meant I could go and be a prime crew on Apollo 13. And I served backup with Colonel Gordon Cooper, who, by the way, also was one of the first to say that he had had UFO experience while he was in the Air Force, before astronaut experience. Anyhow, he retired from the program after Apollo 10 backup, and I was slated for Apollo 13, and Alan Shepard, who had been our first man in space, who had been grounded because of Meniere's syndrome, but had that corrected, and had come back on flight status, and was assigned to Apollo 13 with me. And this was approved by Houston, but headquarters NASA said, Alan, you've been grounded and not flying for a few years. Perhaps best take a little more time to train. So we switched mission with Jim Lovell and his crew, which was Apollo 14. They took 13, we took 14. We didn't like that, but they got the bad machine, we got a good machine. And we went on to the Apollo 13 landing site. So my mission was then Apollo 13/14. And the good part of that was that I was on the ground with Ken Mattingly, who, those of us who know the Apollo 13 history, got bumped from Apollo 13 at the last minute because he had been exposed to Charlie Duke's measles, or one of his children's measles, one of the other astronauts. And the medics was afraid he'd come down with measles in flight, so he was his backup had to substitute for him. That left Ken and I on the ground as the lead lunar module and command module pilots in NASA when the Apollo 13 explosion took place. Our job was to be in the simulators working out the problems they had to work out, because the lunar module had to be a lifeboat, a tugboat, to bring them home. That was my machine. I was lunar module pilot. Ken Mattingly had to figure out how to get the command module back into the atmosphere with not enough energy, because the power source had been destroyed by the explosion in space. So our job was crucial then to helping get the Apollo 13 mission home.